Mhm.
So while Islam is like so wonderful, so perfect, and while Muhammad is the best feminist ever,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on those suffering Muslim women, mainly in Muslim majority countries?
Yeah, that is that just shows you that all these countries must be misinterpreting Islam because they end up with horrible oppression of women wherever Islam spreads. And it's interesting because for a separate video, I'm making a video right now, should be out Monday, called the top 10 myths Muslims believe about Islam. Right. So these are all myths. Let me just, since no one's actually seen this yet or heard this, I'll give people a list of the top 10
Okay.
myths. So this is an exclusive for your channel.
Okay,
Um,
good.
but myth number 10, the Quran contains miraculous scientific insights. Myth number 9, the Quran is a literary miracle. Myth number 8, Muhammad was sinless. Myth number 7, Islam is anti-slavery. Myth number 6, the Quran contains no contradictions. Myth number 5, Islam is a religion of peace. Myth number 4, Islam is pure monotheism. Myth number 3, Islam promotes women's rights. Myth number 2, Islam is spreading rapidly due to conversions. And myth number 1, the Quran has been perfectly preserved. And so going down that list, but on the issue of women's rights, so I was basically trying to get the latest info on this issue. But there are various global research organizations and organizations that are studying women's rights and what's called the gender gap in various countries. So the gender gap, we're a little bit familiar with it in the West when they talk about a wage gap, right? When they talk about here's how much men make and here's how much women make. And so it's a big issue for feminists that men on average make more than women on average. It's people, when you actually study the reasons for that, it turns out not to have much of anything to do with discrimination. It has more to do with like men choosing certain jobs that are much more dangerous, but they pay more, or men going into jobs that just not nearly as many women go into. Like engineering is a high paying job, but you can give women every opportunity to do that. They just for no, I don't even think anyone knows why. I don't want to do that as much as men do. And to be fair, most men don't want to go into that either. But there are just a bit more men who want to go into that field. And then you have the jobs that are like crab fishing, where they go out on boats in these horrible waters, and sometimes the boat just turns over and people die and so on. So basically, you factor that in, and you factor in a situation where it's a tiny minority of men, but it's even fewer women, of people who basically sacrifice sacrifice everything else in life to become the top CEO of an organization. So when I'm giving up everything, and because when you get to like the CEOs of like Amazon and these other companies and so on, these are guys who worked for decades and basically were working 70, 80, 90 hours a week, obsessed with becoming the absolute best. And again, that is a tiny fraction of men who are willing to go through that. But it's even fewer women who want to do that. So basically, once you factor in everything, the difference, the wage gap that you have in the U.S. isn't based on discrimination. It's mostly based on choices and so on. And so there just isn't a whole lot of gender discrimination in the West that's worth talking about. But just to give people an idea, that's what they mean by a gender gap. Here's the average pay of men, and here's the average pay of women. And so you look at that gap and you say, what's the cause of that? Is it discrimination, or is it something else? Well, there are organizations that study things like that around the world. And so they'll study the gender gap in education. What is the average level of education that is reached by men and the average level of education that is reached by women? They'll look at things like rights over their children, right? Like if a man and a woman have a disagreement over the child, or they get divorced or something, what's the level of preference given to the man, and what's the level of preference in court given to the woman? They'll look at the average age when people are married. What's the average age that a man gets married, and what's the average age that a woman gets married?
Yeah.
And so they're looking at all these different factors to find what level of gap there is between the status and rights of men and the status and rights of women. And then they put this forward, and then the question is what accounts for this? Well, the World Economic Forum, they released their 2020 Global Gender Gap Index, which ranks countries based on the economic gap, so how much can a man make, how much can a woman make, the education gap, the health gap, so in terms of access to healthcare and so on, what's the difference between men and women, political gap, what role can men have in politics and what role can women have in politics, and they ranked them, and 9 of the 10 worst countries in the world in terms of the gender gap between men and women were Muslim majority countries, right? So 9 out of 10 were Muslim majority countries. Then you had the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in their 2019 report on social institutions and gender index. This ranks countries based on the levels of discrimination. So not just a gender gap, but level of discrimination against women. How are women looked down upon? Yeah. So they did their ranking system based on levels of discrimination against women. And they found that 10 of the 12 worst countries in the world for women are Muslim majority countries. And so anytime any organization does one of these studies of all countries in the world and examines the level of discrimination against women, examines the extent of the gender gap between men and women, examines differences in the rights afforded to men and the rights afforded to women, they always find 10 out of 12, 9 out of 10, 19 out of 20 of the worst places in the world for women are Muslim majority countries. And so if that's the case, then I would guess that if we're looking for what is the reason for this, what's the reason for this gender gap, what's the reason for this level of discrimination, you should probably be looking at what's common to these nations. And what they have in common is that they are guided by the teachings of Islam. Because notice, it can't be, you can't have something else as the main factor when you have that level of correlation, right? It can't just be, oh, well, some of these countries are really poor countries. Well, some of them aren't poor countries. And if it was just poor countries, then you should find a mix of, Christian countries and everything else. And it should be fairly even because you have all kinds of poor countries in the world. Yeah. You have poor communist countries, you have poor Christian countries, you have poor Muslim countries, you have poor Buddhist countries, you have all kinds of poor countries out there. So what's the main correlation of these countries? It's that they're guided by the teachings of Muhammad. And so we can say, I mean, statistically and factually, that Islam just has a horrible impact on women in the world.
So in that case, one of the things I would struggle to understand, while Western Muslims are screaming out that Islam gives lots of right to the woman, Islam gives value and dignity to the woman, and then you look at the statistics where 9 out of 10, 10 out of 12 Muslim shows how women are simply suffering because they are women, and the common ground is they all follow the teachings of Allah and Muhammad. So how do they match together? Why Western world or Western Muslims are not seeing that?
Yeah, I mean, Muslims in the West, they just have this natural inclination to defend Islam no matter what, and no matter what the actual evidence is. And this goes back to, I think this goes through 14 centuries of Islam, when the Quran says things like, when the Quran said in chapter 4, verse 65 of the Quran, when Allah says that if you have any doubt about anything Muhammad has said, or you even have the slightest bit of disagreement with anything Muhammad has said, you're not a real Muslim. It says you have no real faith until you make Muhammad judge in all disputes and you have no resistance against anything he has said. The impact that those kinds of commands have had on Muslims over the centuries is that you just have to force yourself to not have any sort of doubt about anything Muhammad has said. And you just have to accept it, because as soon as you start saying, I don't know if that's really good, well, great, you're not a real Muslim according to Islam. And so the impact this has had on the Muslim world over the centuries is that people have just become more and more obsessed with praising all things Islamic. And you kind of have to be on the forefront of praising all things Islamic, or people start wondering if you're really a Muslim, right? Like, so this is how you end up with claims like the Quran's been perfectly preserved. We know the Quran has been perfectly preserved. We just did an entire live stream on that. The Quran has changed over and over and over again. Why do they say perfectly preserved right down to the letter? Well, there's just this obsession with exaggerating everything Islamic. And so they can't just say, on balance, we find Muhammad a pretty good guy. They have to say the greatest man who ever lived, even though it's complete nonsense. I mean, if you made a list of the top 10 worst things a human being could do, Muhammad did like 6 or 7 of them. So what sense? I mean, any random person you see walking down the street is a better person than Muhammad. So what do you mean he's the greatest man who ever lived? It's not based on any evidence or reasons. It's just based on them becoming obsessed with praising all things Islamic. And so they carry that inclination to praise and glorify Islam and Muhammad wherever they go. And what happens is when they get to an area that has certain values, they assume, especially if Muslims are raised to believe in those same values, then even without reading their sources or ever seeing what Muhammad said, they'll view Muhammad as the champion of those values. So if they get to a place where peace and tolerance are valued, then Muhammad becomes the most peaceful, tolerant man in the world. And they'll just say that. If they get to an area that praises and values science, then Muhammad was, a master of science 14 centuries ahead of his time. And the Quran is filled with all these scientific miracles and so on. If they get to an area that values women's rights, then Muhammad, it's not just, he had this particular good impact on women or something like this. He's the greatest feminist who ever lived, right? So they have this natural inclination now to praise Muhammad for any good thing, even if it's completely false. But then they apply that to everything that a certain culture values, and they think that Muhammad is the champion of this. And so here in the West, we value women's rights and so on, and they just assume that Muhammad's on the same page. And if you read the sources, my goodness, he most certainly was not. And if you look around the world, you see the fruit of Islam, and it's really, really bad.
Yeah, and a couple of years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, there was a conference, and this Muslim lady who was a Christian before, but she was a journalist also. Mm-hmm. So she became a Muslim, and she's like publicly speaks about her faith and talks about how they need to do dawah, and she does lots of training. So she was sharing her testimony up in Oxford, and I did ask the question where she's gonna end up when she dies, or what is her interpretation of the marital rape in Islam and wife beating. This is like journalist, so by definition she's trained to ask questions. Mm-hmm. And she turned to me and the audience, and then she said, "Oh, I didn't get a chance to look into that." Mm-hmm. And she was like telling people why people need to become a Muslim. Wow. I thought that was very distressing. But if that's okay, I've got a couple of questions. I'll bring them to you.